The words themselves seem fairly easy to say. I forgive you is only 3 short words, 4 syllables, 1 short sentence, but forgiveness itself, that's hard. Hard and messy. It's necessary. All right, forgiveness is necessary for healing, and it's necessary for any relationship to succeed. Long-term married people, would you agree with that one? But it's hard and messy. The process of forgiveness, well, that's hard and messy too. Moving forward when you've been hurt badly, hard and messy. Moving forward without looking back at the scars and being pulled back into all the painful memories. Hard and messy. And getting to a place where you can both say and at the same time mean, I forgive you, when you might not actually be feeling it, well, that's hard and messy. We sometimes seem so much more concerned with getting what I'll call our emotional pound of flesh, with nursing a grudge, with banking bitterness, or with spending our time and our energy on getting the other person to say, well, I was wrong, and still unsure, even if they say it, that we're going to actually offer forgiveness, or whether we're just going to let them hang out there and bleed a little longer. Forgiveness is hard, right? Hard and messy. And sometimes it even seems impossible. I mean, if you're a follower of Jesus, you know that you're supposed to forgive, but actually forgiving, again, sometimes that seems like an almost impossible task. And the deeper the hurt, well, the harder it is. But if you've joined me in this exploration of God's story so far, then one thing that you've seen is that grace and mercy and yes, forgiveness is at the heart of God's heart, at the core of God's being. Another thing you've seen is that, well, God's in the impossible business, and that nothing, absolutely nothing, is too hard for God to do. Not forgiving us, even though it's not hard or easy and came at tremendous cost, and not helping us take steps into forgiveness and healing and reconciliation and restoration in our relationships with other people. Even though it's hard and messy, nothing's too hard or impossible for God to do or to help us do. And a good illustration of that is the story of Joseph. It starts in Genesis chapter 37. Let's dig in.
Jacob continued to live in the land of Canaan, where his father had lived. This is the account of Jacob and his descendants. Joseph was a 17-year-old young man. He took care of the flocks with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. Joseph told his father about the bad things his brothers were doing. Israel loved Joseph more than all his sons because Joseph had been born in Israel's old age. So he made Joseph a special robe with long sleeves. Joseph's brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them. They hated Joseph and couldn't speak to him on friendly terms. Joseph had a dream, and when he told his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Please listen to the dream I had. We were tying grain into bundles out in the field, and suddenly mine stood up. It remained standing while your bundles gathered around my bundle and bowed down to it." Then his brothers asked him, "Are you going to be our king or rule us?" They hated him even more for his dreams and his words. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream. I saw the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowing down to me." When he told his father and his brothers, his father criticized him by asking, "What's this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers come and bow down in front of you?" So his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept thinking about these things. His brothers had gone to take care of their father's flocks at Shechem. Israel then said to Joseph, "Your brothers are taking care of the flocks at Shechem. I'm going to send you to them." Joseph responded, "I'll go." So Israel said, "See how your brothers and the flocks are doing, and bring some news back to me." Then he sent Joseph away from the Hebron Valley. When Joseph came to Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the open country. "What are you looking for?" the man asked. Joseph replied, "I'm looking for my brothers. Please tell me where they're taking care of their flocks." The man said, "They moved on from here. I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him from a distance. Before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. They said to each other, "Look, here comes that master dreamer. Let's kill him, throw him into one of the cisterns, and say that a wild animal has eaten him. Then we'll see what happens to his dreams." When Reuben heard this, he tried to save Joseph from their plot. "Let's not kill him," he said. "Let's not have any bloodshed. Put him into that cistern that's out in the desert, but don't hurt him." Reuben wanted to rescue Joseph from them and bring him back to his father. So when Joseph reached his brothers, they stripped him of his special robe with long sleeves. Then they took him and put him into an empty cistern. It had no water in it. As they sat down to eat, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were carrying the materials for cosmetics, medicine, and embalming. They were on their way to take them to Egypt. Judah asked his brothers, "What will we gain by killing our brother and covering up his death? Let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. Let's not hurt him, because he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. As the Midianite merchants were passing by, the brothers pulled Joseph out of the cistern. They sold him to the Ishmaelites for 8 ounces of silver. The Ishmaelites took him to Egypt.
So what you see at the very beginning of Genesis 37, the start of Joseph's story, is that Joseph, son number 11 out of 12 to Jacob, grows up as his father's favorite son, with all the perks that favored sons enjoy, and also the accompanying pride and self-importance that often goes along with that. But now Joseph is in Egypt. He's in Egypt not on a pleasure trip, but as a slave. The proud, spoiled, self-indulgent, full of himself teenager, dad's clear and obvious favorite, has had his world turned completely upside down by his brothers. And everything that Joseph thought was his or would be his is gone. Right? That special robe with long sleeves, that's gone. Ripped to shreds and dipped in blood so that the brothers could give Jacob some, quote, proof that Joseph was dead. What that long robe with special sleeves signified, that Joseph, son number 11 out of 12, was going to get all the special privileges that in that world were supposed to go to son number 1. Well, that's all gone too. Joseph's stuff, that's all gone. Took nothing with him in Egypt except his life. Joseph's freedom and his rights and his prospects, gone. Slaves have none of those. Joseph's family and his friends, gone. They're back in Canaan, all believing the story that was told that Joseph was killed by a wild animal. And those who knew better, the brothers who were there and did that to Joseph and sold him into slavery, well, they're keeping quiet about the whole affair. And Joseph's dreams of having everyone in his family bow down to him, again, gone. Poof, like a vapor in the wind. Yep, everything that Joseph had was gone. And it was his own brothers who did it. And as you go on in the story, it doesn't get any better than that. Turn to Genesis chapter 39 and start reading the rest of Joseph's story. And what you find is that Joseph ends up in prison because his master's wife got mad that he wouldn't sleep with her. And then he ends up stuck in prison because the guy who said he'd remember him doesn't. And he's stuck in that miserable place for what seems like an eternity. It certainly was several years. And all those things, they happened because of his brothers. Those dirty, rotten, miserable scoundrels who got jealous of a young, self-important, immature little kid and planned to kill him until they figured they could profit from him, and so they sold him into Egypt, where much of the time he was as good as dead. And if you're Joseph, you're like, how could they? How could they? His brothers. If you're Joseph, do you think you could forget any of that? Or are you nursing a grudge? Are you dreaming of the day that you can get your revenge? If only I can get out of here. After all they've taken from you, right, how could you ever forgive? How could you ever forgive? Hard? Messy? I'd say impossible. And then something else improbable happens. Joseph's story actually takes a turn. It takes a turn when Joseph gets out of prison. And he ends up being second in command in the whole country. Joseph answered only to Pharaoh, and everybody else answered to Joseph. He's the second most powerful man in arguably the most powerful nation on earth at that time. What an incredible reversal of fortune to where he'd been. And then something happened that Joseph never, ever expected. Right? In Genesis chapter 42, and then going on from there, what happens is that Joseph's brothers, these are the same brothers that did all that cruddy stuff to him, that turned his life upside down and had taken away everything from him that he started out with, they show up in Egypt. They show up in Egypt coming to buy food because the famine was bad in Canaan too, not just Egypt. And while the brothers didn't recognize Joseph, Joseph recognized them. Now, what do you think is going on here? In his new position as Pharaoh's go-to guy, Joseph now quite literally has their life in his hands. And Joseph remembered everything. So, if you're Joseph in that situation, what do? You know you're not supposed to play God. You know that you're not supposed to plot revenge. You know you're not supposed to hold a grudge forever. You know that you're actually supposed to forgive. You're not supposed to withhold forgiveness because your God is the God who's gracious and compassionate and slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. But doesn't that seem sort of theoretical at this point? Sort of like classroom stuff? Because these are the guys who cost you everything. These are the guys who caused you so much pain. These are the guys that you've been dreaming about getting back at as you're nursing that grudge. And now if you got not only the opportunity, but you've got the power to get back at them. You literally hold their life in your hands, and you can treat them at least as badly as they treated you. And if you want to, if you've got a mind to, you can make their life even worse. So, what do? Forgiveness might be the right thing, but forgiveness is hard. And sometimes it's just too hard and messy. Would you agree with that? Think about your own life for a minute. What have you found hard about forgiveness, and why? So what does Joseph do in that situation? Well, you know what? Joseph doesn't forgive right away. If you read through Genesis chapter 42 to 45, when Joseph's brothers first come to Egypt, I think what you're going to find there is Joseph's own struggle with forgiveness. Not just the words, but the whole process. I mean, forgiveness is hard, remember? Hard and messy. And Joseph struggles with all of it. Again, Joseph knows he shouldn't play God, and he knows he should forgive, but I don't think, as I read through those 3-4 chapters, that he really wants to forgive, at least not at first. And it takes Joseph a little time, a lot of time actually, to get to the point of actually forgiving. Why? Well, first, because the hurt, the wounds, the pain, the memory, it all ran pretty deep. Maybe you know what that's like. The second reason that he doesn't jump to forgive right away is because forgiveness works a little differently with us than it does with God. I mean, when God forgives, first of all, he totally forgets, which is an absolute miracle. Something that we're not able to do, something that only God can do, totally forget. And the other thing that happens when God forgives, it is instantaneous. God says, I forgive you, and right there, it's done. The moment you ask, you're forgiven. With us, not usually quite like that. With us, forgiveness is more of a process. Forgiveness is hard. And again, it's often quite messy. Sure was in this case. All right, let's jump ahead now through a lot of years, some time and events to chapter 45, when forgiveness actually begins to break through and Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. I'm reading from Genesis chapter 45, beginning at verse 1. Joseph could no longer control his emotions in front of everyone who was standing around him, so he cried out, "Have everyone leave me." No one else was there when Joseph told his brothers who he was. He cried so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" His brothers could not answer him because they were afraid of him. "Please come closer to me," Joseph said to his brothers. When they did so, he said, "I am Joseph, the brother you sold into slavery in Egypt. Now don't be sad or angry with yourselves that you sold me. God sent me ahead of you to save lives. The famine has been in the land for 2 years. There will be 5 more years without plowing and harvesting. God sent me ahead of you to make sure that you would have descendants on the earth and to save your lives in an amazing way. It wasn't you who sent me here, but God. He has made me like a father to Pharaoh, lord over his entire household and ruler of Egypt." Now I get to there and you see Joseph saying, I forgive you. But again, it took from chapter 42, 43, 44 till we get to chapter 45. And there's a lot of time and events between those things. So the first thing I notice here is that, it took time. Several chapters worth of time until the process of forgiveness could actually work through and he could begin to forgive. I think that's what the crying is about and the wailing is about in verse 2. Again, he cried so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it too. And crying, by the way, if you follow through the story and jump to chapter 50, that happens again. I mean, chapter 50 is after his whole family has moved down to Egypt. father included, and the brothers are now scared again because their fathers died. And what they're thinking is that Joseph's been holding a grudge because that's what they would do. And he's just kind of put it off because he doesn't want to hurt Dad. But now Dad's dead and wants to stop Joseph from getting back at them. So they make this story up to protect themselves and tell Dad that, hey, Joseph wrote it in his will that you're supposed to forgive these guys. And again, we hear the sound of crying. I'm going to jump down to chapter 50, verse 17. Joseph cried when he got their message. Then his brothers also came and immediately bowed down in front of him. "We are your slaves," they said. Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. I can't take God's place. Even though you planned evil against me, God planned good to come out of it. This was to keep many people alive, as he is now doing. Don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." In this way he reassured them, setting their minds at ease. Now, I want to focus in on that crying. Do you know what the crying is, I think, in both cases, both chapter 45 and chapter 50 here? I think in both cases it's a release of all this built-up emotion in Joseph. And it's a recognition of how hard and messy and sometimes even how painful true forgiveness is. It's like all the crying and wailing and grieving is expressing what I think Joseph had to be feeling at that moment. After all that you've done, it is really amazing that I'm forgiving you, that I'm even thinking of forgiving you. And is. Right? It is amazing, painful, it's messy, and so unnatural. See, the kind of forgiveness that Joseph is giving here, it hurts. Behind every act of forgiveness is a wound of betrayal. And that sort of pain doesn't easily go away. In fact, I think that pain doesn't ever really go away at all until God enters the picture, which is the second big thing I see in this part of Joseph's story. Joseph had matured spiritually. Now he sees what he hadn't seen before. That even in all the bad, he sees that God was still working. God was still working, even though he didn't send the bad. God was there in the bad, working to bring about a good end. Let me read again, chapter 50, verse 20. "Even though you planned evil against me, God planned good to come out of it." And the good here ended up being that not only was Joseph in a position to help many people and save many lives, the good was also that every step of the way, God was with Joseph too. Not only helping him to mature, not only helping him get a bigger picture perspective, not only helping him learn the humbleness of heart that he needed to learn, not only helping him work through the hurt, but also working in Joseph's heart to help him get to the place where he could let go of the past. And he could let go of the past by making a deliberate choice to forgive. Let me say that again. Forgiveness is a deliberate choice to let go of the past. I mean, after all you've done, it is amazing that I am forgiving you. And it was. It is amazing, unnatural, and also godly. Remember, God's grace and mercy and love and forgiveness is at the core of God's heart. And Joseph's able to get there through all this pain and all this time because in everything, God was working to get him there. Kind of reminds me of something that Paul said in Romans chapter 8. Romans chapter 8, verse 28. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. Again, make some connections and think about your own life for a moment. How have you seen God working behind the scenes to bring good out of a bad situation? So let's recap what we're learning about forgiveness in the story of Joseph. Forgiveness is hard, and often it's messy, and it's certainly not easy. We're seeing that forgiveness doesn't come naturally, that it's not our way, it's God's way. But we've also seen that forgiveness is a process that, yes, it might take some time, and a process that, if we're going to be successful at it, is certainly going to need God's help. But we've also seen in the story of Joseph that forgiveness is possible. Real forgiveness is possible even for the deepest of wounds, because, as we've seen in Joseph's story, that's because God is always working. In everything, God is always working. Even in our pain, God is working in us, and God is working for us, and God is working to bring about good. God is working to bring about healing, working to help us forgive even when we feel that we can't. God is working to help us see that, well, if Joseph can forgive after all that he went through, well, we can forgive too. If we let God work in us, because the power to forgive comes from him. Now, some people are hurt so bad, and maybe you're one of them. Some people are hurt so bad that even if they know they should forgive, they prefer to stay bitter and angry, as if doing so is going to hurt the other person who hurt them. Well, to me, that's kind of like drinking poison yourself and thinking that the other person is going to die. Right? There is a better way. It's what I'll call the Jesus way. Let me read from something Paul wrote, Ephesians chapter 4, verse 32. Be kind and tender-hearted, forgiving one another, just as in Christ God forgave you. Just as in Christ God forgave you. So how did Jesus forgive? If we're going to learn to forgive like Jesus? Well, Jesus came to his own people, and his own people rejected him. Jesus offered his life for the world, and the world put him to death on a cross. Jesus spent the better part of 3 years helping his disciples learn to know him, and when Jesus needed him most, what'd they do? They fell asleep and denied him and ran away like they had no idea who he was. And Jesus experienced that hurt, that pain, that rejection, not just from his enemies, but from his friends. And still Jesus pursued the hard and the messy path that would bring us forgiveness. Right? Jesus stayed where he was on that Friday, even though he could have left the cross at any time. He hung on the cross, bleeding and dying for the sins of the world, for the sins of his people, for the sins of us. And what do we hear Jesus say on the cross? Well, just you wait. You may be getting me now, but I'm going to come back, and then you're really going to get it. And you don't even hear him say something like, well, if you do turn around, good, but you're going to have to do like 1,000 years of penance to make up for all the bad that you've done. No, on the cross, we hear Jesus say things like, "Today, you'll be with me in paradise." And he said that to a career criminal who had a lifetime of doing bad stuff, and then at the last minute turns to Jesus and looks for forgiveness. And he says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," to those who are nailing him to a cross. Now, it sounds almost too good to be true. But we don't know anybody like that. Such abundant mercy, such free forgiveness, such amazing grace is so outside our day-to-day experience that we have a hard time believing it. But it's true. That's what our God is like. And the truth we see in this story of Joseph is not only is that what our God is like, that's also what our God helps us to do. Helps us to forgive, even though it's hard. Helps us to forgive, even though it's messy. Helps us to forgive, even when you don't feel like it. Helps us to forgive, even when you're still feeling hurt. Helps you to forgive and keep pursuing this process of forgiveness, even though, because we're human, it's going to take some time. Sometimes, like in Joseph's case, a long time. God helps us to forgive by making a choice with his help to not let the past continue to control the relationship anymore. To make a choice, let me say that again, to not let the past continue to control the relationship anymore, but instead to forgive and to move on. Now that's hard and it's messy, but you can do that, even if for you it takes a miracle. You know why? Because God's in the miracle business. God's in the miracle business, and in everything, even in your hurt and pain, God is there and he's working. He's working toward our good. And he's working to help us do what's hard and what's messy and what we often can't do by ourselves. Forgive. Forgive just like he forgave us. So think about this for a minute. What if with all this hurt and pain and messiness that goes on in our life, what if we'd be willing to start letting go of things? What if we'd be said, I'm not going to hold on to the hurt anymore? What if we said, I'm going to stop banking my bitterness? What if we said, I'm not going to store up my anger until I'm in a position to hold it against you? What if instead we said, you know what? Yeah, I've been hurt, but I'm going to trust all this into the hands of a God who's been overwhelmingly gracious with me. Now, yeah, that's hard, and it's messy, and I can't sometimes really deal with that on my own. So, you know what? I'm just going to let Jesus deal with that, because he knows what to do with that. He knows what to do with them. He knows what to do with me. And that's the process of forgiveness. Now, if we did that, is it possible we could get hurt again? Yeah, I guess that's, the risk of love. But that's also the way of Jesus. And it's the only way to move forward in relationships.